So, Hoyoverse announced version 5.2 today, and, there's Chasca, Ororon, there's going to be a whole new area in Natland to explore, and that's all fun, that's great, right? I look forward to that. But in their developer discussion notes, they secretly announced what I am really excited for, because it's a very rare change to the game that actually buffs characters, old characters most importantly. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the reaction buffs. I want to mention quick how they just snuck this in. Let's look at the developer discussion that they released for Genshin 5.2. Kuki, shush. So you can say, okay, treasure compass optimizations, that's nice. That'll be more useful. Inventory management optimizations, there's a favorite button now, sweet. Oh, the teapot, we can collect wood even better now, wonderful. Imagine they didn't, wait a minute. Right here. They just snuck it in between. Oh, Imaginarium Theater gets this giant section. You get a whole section about inventory management features, and then an actual mechanical change to the game. It's just hidden here. The base damage of Overload, Superconduct, Electro-Charge, and Shatter reactions will be increased. So they didn't say, what the actual increases were, but we'll just say I can make some educated guesses. And those educated guesses are that Superconduct is getting a 3 times damage increase, Shatter damage is getting a doubling, Electro-Charge is getting a 70% damage increase, and Overload is getting about a 40% damage increase. All of those reactions are transformative reactions that are like Hyperbloom, wherein the damage that they deal will be based on your character's level at a baseline, and then the character's elemental mastery stat will be multiplied from the base multiplier of the reaction based on whatever the character's level is, right? Now, all 4 of those reactions are, in the current scope of like Genshin teams, are reactions that are not utilized as heavily currently, and Genshin has been heading down lately towards the route, in my opinion at least, of, more really strong crit-based DPSs more often than anything, or ways to, buff those crit-based DPSs. And it's fun, farming for the rare artifacts and getting all the crit stats and seeing really big numbers in your characters, of course, right? But it's also pretty important for, I think, the health of the game to be able to have more accessible ways of dealing damage that aren't just, farming for crit stats. This is going to result in uplifting the strength of some characters that you may not have realized. Like none of those reactions are animal reactions, right? Except for if you understand how the swirl reaction works, and this lady is a 4-star character who wants to be built for elemental mastery, and she buffs the team's elemental mastery, and when you trigger swirl, you can apply pyro, hydro, cryo, or electro, and trigger those reactions with sucrose. Which is to say, sucrose is getting a pretty meaningful buff in version 5.2. And so is Kazuo, by the way. Both of these are animo characters that can trigger those reactions, and they normally are belt EM anyway, so they're just basically getting a direct buff. Also, I think it's worth mentioning, that we're getting Electro-Charge and Overload buffs. Those are Electro reactions, and, Fischl got buffed in version 3.0 with the release of Dendro, because, that was really strong for Electro. And then last year, this artifact set release that gave Fischl 70% skill damage bonus, and now this year, they're just buffing the Electro reactions. Somehow every year, without fail, it seems Fischl gets a buff, and that's fantastic. If only they'd rerun her. Alright, so to get just a baseline understanding of these damage increases for the reactions, I'm going to trigger Superconduct, Overload, as well as Electro-Charge. Put Pyro on this dude. 16,000 overload damage. Nice. So you can see, yep. 16,000. Of course, as always, it's important to remember that how much that damage really matters is going to be dependent on, how much your character is actually triggering the reactions, how much, Electro Kuki applies relative to how much Pyro is being put on the enemy. So Overload is getting the smallest increase of the 4 reactions, but that would take Overload damage in this exact same instance in the next version of the game to about 22,000 damage with the exact same build. And for Electro-Charge, Kuki is getting 9,639 damage. Its base scaling is being increased to the same base scaling as Overload is currently. So that means that 9,600 damage we got will be 16,000 damage in the next version of the game. And the Electro-Charge buff is probably the most significant buff. Even though the damage is not as high as something like Overload, Electro-Charge has very high value in AoE situations. I'm probably not going to get super in-depth into the details of how these reactions work. I will try to remember to link some resources in the video description in case you're interested in learning more of specifics that I don't go over in this video. Alright, Superconduct is getting a 3 times increase. You can see we're getting 4,000 damage there. Yeah, we're getting 4,000 damage. Superconduct deals AoE cryo damage in case it wasn't obvious. And that damage will increase by 3 times, so all the way to about 12,000, 13,000 damage from Superconduct. Superconduct, you know, decreases enemies' physical resistance, and because physical isn't the strongest thing in this game, it's not necessarily crazily relevant, especially because we really just don't have that many options for good cryo appliers in the game. So that limits like the max potential you could have from actually triggering a lot of, you know, electro and cryo reactions. Either way, though, I'd still say it's a positive change because, you know, hey, more sources of damage. Now, the shatter reaction is a weird one that I imagine there's a good chance a lot of the viewers of this video just don't even know that shatter is a thing. And that's, to be honest, because it doesn't really matter. Except now it matters a bit more. Shatter's base damage is being increased to the same as hyperbloom. So if you have, you know, 1,000 EM on a unit that can trigger shatter, you could see 30,000 damage, right, from shatter. And that's certainly significant damage. That doesn't mean you're actually triggering it at the same rate as hyperbloom, though, so this is not going to be like, oh my god, shatter is the new meta. No. So anyways, what shatter is, it's something I can't test on this thing, because it is a reaction that happens on top of the freeze reaction. So if you freeze enemies with cryo and hydro, you can then do attacks with heavy, blunt, or like poise. So that'd be, you know, attacks like from Claymore units. Anything that seems like it has a big impact is probably something that can trigger shatter. Alternatively, geo damage can also trigger the shatter reaction. So let's see what we can trigger here. So we'll do this, and then bam. There we go. And bam. So we're gonna go put full EM on Dia. Alright, 837 EM on Dia should be good enough. So we got them frozen, and then we can do blam. We can see we saw 8,700 shatter damage, right? I think we saw 9,200 there, yep. That's shatter. And I believe shatter clears the frozen status as well. So basically shatter is limited by how many heavy attacks you can do and how often you can trigger the freeze reaction. It's an interesting additional way to get damage out of the freeze reaction. And right now you can see with about 10,000 damage there, it's not as significant, but with the scaling increase, that would be 20,000 damage in the same exact build. And that's without having, you know, Superconduct going on, which would reduce physical resistance and increase that damage, right? Hopefully that gives you a good idea of, you know, the general damage increase we can expect to see from these reactions. There's a whole bunch of different things I want to mess around with these. It's why I've been farming for a little bit here. I wanted a surplus of resources because, yeah, actually, let's talk about Shatter first. Shatter is simultaneously not going to be that relevant, but I also think someone like Kaveh actually might gain a little bit from it. I don't think this is going to, again, this is not going to be like, oh my god, Kaveh is amazing now, but it will make EM Kaveh better. He has this whole thing with slightly increasing bloom damage and causing them to explode immediately. With Shatter and whatever going on, by the way, the bloom reaction damage will be actually less than the Shatter damage, which is kind of funny. So the team would be maybe like Kaveh, fiiiine, Rosaria, and then whatever healer we'd probably need. And I think that team would probably work. Is it going to easily clear content? Not necessarily. And of course it suffers from the fact that, you know, the freeze only works on enemies that are freezable. And Hoyo likes to do abyss cycles that basically never have a freezable side the full way through because they decided they hate cryo. So I don't know, maybe this means they're actually going to make, you know, cryo a little bit more relevant in different situations again, and they're not just going to always put bosses that are immune to being frozen. So it's going to be situational, but Shatterbloom Kaveh, being that he's already a Claymore unit intended to build EM, I think there's some shenanigans you can do with it, right? And I think it has the potential to make physical teams a little bit better in a weird way. I look forward to messing around with Shatter and the Superconduct buff. The Overload buff is interesting, like in the context of chevreuse teams, you might think. And the answer that I would say is yes, it is. But the problem with Overload is that when you trigger Overload, if you have your Pyro unit trigger it, or you have your Electro unit trigger it, it will always consume the same amount of the reaction. And the other issue is, even when it's doing a lot more damage, there's a limit of 1 instance of overload damage can be dealt to enemies, and overload is a sizable AoE damage too. But they can only take 1 instance of that every half second. This is compared to like hyperbloom, where there's a limit of 2 instances of hyperbloom damage on enemies every half second, right? You can trigger 2 overloads in 0.5 seconds, but the enemy, you won't see any damage numbers if you do that, right? There's an issue in not being able to control which unit is triggering the overload very often. For example, if you're doing a chevreuse team that is using 1 electro unit and a whole lot of pyro, because we're doing, Shungling, the pyro carry, right? Like, this lady applies so much pyro, and Yai does not apply enough electro to keep up with that pyro, such that there should always almost be pyro on enemies, and then we know that Yai is always triggering overload. So yeah, in this context of this kind of team, we'll see a meaningful increase in damage. But if we switch it up back to Fischl here, and this is a team I use all the time, in this team, it's not necessarily going to be very consistently Yai or Fischl triggering an overload. Like after I use Chevreuse burst, her burst will do a bunch of pyro on the enemy, and when that happens, then it should be Yai or Fischl triggering overload. But because there's 2 electros, like which one is triggering? You get the point, right? It's hard to actually control who is triggering the overloads. Since overload is an AoE reaction, right, you can end up triggering overload on one enemy and then very shortly after trigger overload on another enemy, but you won't actually see the damage happen from that second overload. You'll see the reaction happen, but no damage will happen on both enemies. Alright, so put that down, and then we do that. Right, we're triggering a lot of reactions, to be clear, right? But you can see that half-second delay a little bit there, hopefully that was obvious, right? Ultimately, all this means is that the overload reaction's max potential is not crazily different than it was before, is what I feel. The limit on the damage instances and the inability to control it without having teams that are heavily lopsided towards a lot of electro or a lot of pyro makes it hard to even know, if you should build EM. But I will say that this overload buff, I use this weird Raiden build even in a chevreuse team where I have EM crit on her with Staff of Scarlet Sands, so my build is 462 EM. This build, I recall, after we get, chevreuse buffs going and whatnot, ends up, I believe, dealing somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 damage. Of course, I don't have Shungling up, but, okay, I was wrong, 13,000 damage. But it's a pretty meaningful amount of AoE damage, is what it notably is. The reason I'm using this as an example is because this is an example where the overload damage increases Raiden's off-field damage contribution in this team quite meaningfully. Like, while I'm rotating between different things, and doing this, Raiden's E is doing a whole bunch of AoE overload damage. And I really like this build on her for this team because you can see I can still get good damage. And then I can also get some decent off-field damage, and it's also a way to increase her damage that doesn't require bursting on her, so that can help smooth out enemies that have just a little bit of HP left versus having to burst, do a whole new rotation kind of thing. For anyone familiar with my channel, the simple way of saying it is that hybrid Raiden is being buffed. And it's not just in overload context, it's also in bloom contexts. My point is this is more just a context where there's a low amount of electro application. Anytime Raiden applies electro, she should be triggering overload. And with getting about, 15,000 damage and overloads there, that increase is going to be meaningful. I'm probably going to notice the damage increase. A more normal situation for people in chevreuse teams would be if you're using a pyro on fielder, I would say, and you have, Kuki on a tenacity build, or Raiden on a tenacity build, I guess, on full EM in a chevreuse team. That is a thing you can do. People do Linny chevreuse teams, I believe. Right, this would be a DPS increase in those teams, but it's relatively limited in scope, I think is all it is. How valuable it will be is going to be really dependent on an individual team. Fundamentally, overload teams are not going to have overload be the primary damage contributor on their own. It's just going to be an additional way to smooth out the team's damage. Now, electro-charged teams are already teams that I think are a bit stronger than I think people might expect, particularly in the context of when you can do electro-charge with fiiiine. You do fiiiine, Fischl, and animal unit together, and then as long as you have, healing going on to stay at living, it's pretty good. My Sucrose is not even level 90, although she will probably be level 90 next patch with the buffs. But let me just show you how this is going to work in this current version of the game here. Do that. We'll do that. I could actually maybe consider putting Kokomi on Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, but like Sucrose's ability to just be on-fielded and whatnot, and like, you could see the damage is pretty dang good. We'll throw out that. I should make sure I don't forget having Fischl going. The team is freeform, so you know having Kokomi is potentially nice because we can swap to different units to get healing. We don't have to like remain on field with any particular unit. We can burst on Kokomi if we need to get a little bit of additional damage out. Ororon is releasing next patch too, by the way, and he's an electro-charged focused unit that may end up being better than Fischl in AoE situations, in particular, I would say. But like, you can see all the damage numbers popping up on screen. Those are going to be bigger at next patch. Meaningfully bigger. And essentially what the electro-charge reaction is doing, in case it's not obvious, is there's the little chain of when you trigger the reaction, it bounces to other enemies to deal damage. Those little lightning bolts that are going around everywhere are, you know, all dealing the electro-charge damage with, you know, the EM of whoever did the element application. And the reason the animal units that get built for Swirl are so strong in this is because you can have the same problem I mentioned with Overload, wherein you don't really know if your Electro or your Hydro unit is triggering the reaction. So you can use an Anima unit to swirl Hydro and Electro around, and the auras coexist on enemies, so it's really easy to do that. And that, of course, buffs your talent damage of your Fischl and your fiiiine in this context, because you have 4-piece Viridescent, right? This gives 40 Res Shred. But then Sucrose, of course, swirling those elements around triggers the electro-charged reactions with whatever elements got swirled based on her elemental mastery, and like it's just really good. And you can do, you know, Kazuha variants. Depending on what you have going on the team, Kazuha might be better than Sucrose, but Sucrose is the more accessible option. She can do this at C0. She's a Catalyst unit, right? So you can do normal charge attacks. Just being able to get those reactions with her normal attacks is pretty significant. Sucrose is already situationally stronger than Kazuha because EM buffs are strong, but I think Sucrose is gaining a lot from this version update, and electro-charged teams in particular are gaining a lot. Though it is, of course, worth mentioning that one of the big components that makes Hyperbloom as strong as it is the fact that the Electro unit that's triggering the blooms is also getting electro charge damage. So this is actually a buff to Hyperbloom teams. We'll go back to Kuki. Do that. Blam. And you can see we're gonna get super ducks here as well because I put a cryo unit in the team. We can do freezing. We can like you see the what's gonna happen with this kind of team in this version of the game, right? The Hyperbloom damage itself is not being buffed, but all those additional reactions are triggering in this instance are getting buffed. You know, but me being bad, notwithstanding at playing this team here, if you go and slow down the footage, right, you can see electro-charge triggering, you can see some of the superconduct triggering, right? Like, I think it is actually kind of important for this team to become a little bit stronger. So yada yada, point being, the value it gives will be variable, but it's important to remember that, you know, the relevance of electro-charge is not just for purely, you know, taser teams where you're doing an Animo, Hydro, and Electro unit, but it's also for teams where you're doing, you know, Dendro things. I think these transformative reactions getting buffed, being a buff to many different teams, is a really, really important change for the game. But, you know, I am a little bit biased as someone that just likes this game for being able to just be like, okay, what weird things can we do with Sethos? Now I want to talk about things I can do with Sethos with these changes. Yes, Sethos is getting buffed. He's already someone you built for EM, and I already used this dude for like electro-charged teams and overload teams before, and now those are even better. Like, yay, right? So, anyways, like I if it's not obvious, I actually like am quite excited about this change. It makes me want to build Razor more. I want to build Lisa. I just got her C4, so you know you can subscribe for a video about that. Hyperbloom Eula gains from it. It's kind of sad that Hyperbloom Eula gains from it, but Hyperbloom Eula does gain from these changes. These changes benefit the lesser used characters the most, which means for a lot of you watching, maybe this is an extremely unexciting change, right? But just for giving me more viable ways to make Fremine deal damage, even if it's not going to be his best playstyle or whatever, I think that's a really good change in the game. if they end up just making Abyss Cycles insanely stronger, and the end result might be that we don't really necessarily notice, but I think for how I play the game, I am definitely going to notice these changes, and I greatly appreciate that. And I find it funny that Hoyo was just snuck this in the little footnote in the dev discussion. It's like one of the most meaningful balance changes they've had in the game in a while, the yearly official buff, and they're just like, hey, this is a little bit of additional thing we're doing. Like, okay. Anyways, I love Arlecchino, but you know, I like the reaction system in the game more than I love any individual character, because the reaction system is what lets me do all kinds of weird things with different characters. So I'm quite excited about this. I'm gonna have to spend a whole bunch of resources on different characters, mucking about with things. And yeah, we'll see how it is. Maybe I'll change my tune and it'll be like, wow, this was boring, but I'm excited about it. I'm sure I'm gonna have some videos messing about with these changes in a couple weeks here. So, I don't know, feel free to subscribe if you're interested in that. Blah, 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 blah.